The autumn of 1943 fell heavy over the Ukrainian plains, like a shroud of dead leaves and smoke clinging to the damp air. The Dnieper River, wide and treacherous, snaked like a dark vein through the exhausted body of the earth, separating what remained of the free world from the chaos of Nazi occupation. The Battle of Kursk, still fresh in everyone's memory, had been the invisible turning point, not a resounding victory, but a mutual exhaustion that broke the German momentum. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein retreated his Army Group South forces toward the Dnieper, leaving behind ruined cities and fields mined with improvised graves. His soldiers, once the Wehrmacht elite, now marched with empty eyes, uniforms torn, and boots sinking into mud that swallowed dreams of quick glory. On the other side of the river, the Red Army seethed with feverish determination. Nikolai Vatutin, commander of the 1st Ukrainian Front, paced back and forth in his makeshift tent, the Dnieper map stretched like taut skin over the splintered wooden table. His eyes, sharp as blades, traced invisible lines of advance, from Belgorod to Kharkov, where September offensives had pushed the fascists back in a bloody rout. But the Dnieper was the final obstacle, the threshold to recapturing Kiev, the mother of Russian cities, captured in 1941 in one of the Soviet war's greatest defeats. Vatutin knew Stalin watched from Moscow, his invisible hand tightening the collar of each general. Force the crossing, the Vozhd had ordered, liberate Kiev before winter. In a muddy trench south of Kiev, in the so-called Bukhrin bridgehead, Sergeant Ivan Petrovich Kovalenko cleaned his Mosin Nagant with a dirty cloth, his calloused fingers trembling not from cold, but contained rage. Ivan was 28, a Poltava peasant turned soldier, with an irregular scar on his left face, a memento from a German grenade at Stalingrad. Beside him, young recruit Alexei Dmitrievich, 19, barely disguised his terror as he drew crosses in the ground with his rifle butt. "Sergeant, I heard the Germans have panthers waiting on the other side," Alexei murmured, voice low to avoid waking exhausted comrades. Ivan spat in the mud. "Panthers? They're starving rats, boy. Starving for home, for bread, for anything but this mud shit." But deep down, Ivan doubted. October attempts to break out from Bukhrin had been a massacre, waves of infantry advancing under artillery fire, only to be repelled by Walter Nering's 24th Panzer Corps. Bodies floated in the Dnieper like rotten timber, and the stench of decay rose with the morning mist. Meanwhile, to the north at the Lyutich bridgehead, a secret movement took shape. Under cover of night, Lieutenant General Pavel Semenovich Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army transferred its armored columns in absolute silence. T-34 tanks crept slowly along the improvised road, engines muffled by blankets and mud spread to dampen sound. Rybalko, a 45-year-old man with a thick mustache and eyes like wells of stoic determination, rode in a jeep ahead of the main column. "Faster, comrades," he whispered to his officers. "Vatutin doesn't forgive delays." Deception was key. False attacks at Bukhrin would distract the Germans, while 26 bridges and 87 ferries were erected at Lyutich, many submerged to avoid the Stukas. 7,000 guns and mortars waited, lined up like silent sentinels, and 700 aircraft from the 2nd Guards Air Corps hovered invisible in the cloudy sky. In Kiev's ghost streets, under Nazi yoke for over 2 years, Maria Ivanovna Shevchenko crouched in a damp basement on Khreshchatyk Street, her heart beating like a war drum. At 32, widow of an officer purged in 1937, Maria raised alone her 10-year-old daughter Olena and 7-year-old son Petro. The city, once a beacon of golden domes and elegant boulevards, was now a hollow shell. St. Sophia Cathedral profaned as a stable, the Opera Theatre bombed in 1941, and streets patrolled by German soldiers with snarling Alsatian dogs. Maria worked as a laundress for the Kommandantur, washing uniforms stained with Ukrainian blood, but at night whispered stories of partisans to neighbors. "The Reds are coming," she told Olena while weaving a rag doll. "I heard on the clandestine radio. They'll liberate us." But fear was constant. Summary executions for hiding Jews, hunger gnawing at bones, and the distant drone of aircraft promising death from the sky. At 4th Panzer Army headquarters, in a reinforced bunker 20 kilometers east of Kiev, General Hermann Hoth smoked cigarette after cigarette, the map before him marked with red warning arrows. Hoth, a rigid 58-year-old Prussian, knew Manstein pressed him for reinforcements, but Hitler, in his Berlin fury, denied entire panzer divisions. "Hold the Dnieper," the Führer had screamed by phone. The 7th Army Corps under General Gustav Anton von Mauchenheim, genannt Bechtolsheim, defended positions north of Kiev with exhausted infantry and the 24th Panzer Corps to the south. "The Ivans will try again," Hoth told his operations chief, Major Hans Speidel. "But this time we crush them at the river." Speidel nodded, but his eyes betrayed doubt. Spy reports spoke of movements at Liutij, but the feints at Bukrin seemed more convincing. The dawn of November 1st arrived like an icy whisper. At Bukrin, the 27th and 40th Armies launched the diversionary attack 2 days ahead of schedule, a miscalculation Vatutin would curse later. Waves of Soviet infantry, supported by howling Katyushas, advanced 5 kilometers along the muddy bank, only to be stopped by a barrage of German Nebelwerfers. Bodies fell like leaves in the wind, and Sergeant Ivan, leading his section, saw Alexei hit in the chest by an MP-40 burst. "Get up, boy!" Ivan shouted, dragging the body behind a fallen log, but Alexei's eyes already glazed in emptiness. "Mother! Tell my mother!" the recruit murmured, before falling silent. Ivan swore vengeance there, in mud mixed with blood, as the Germans counterattacked with fierce grenadiers. 2 days later, in the suffocating darkness of November 3rd, hell descended on German lines. At 4 a.m., 7,000 Soviet artillery pieces roared in unison, thunder that shook the earth for 40 minutes. Shells of 152 mm and 203 mm rained on bunkers and machine gun nests, transforming the ground into smoking craters. The air smelled of cordite and upturned earth, and German soldiers of the 7th Corps cowered in their foxholes, helmets clanging with impacts. "Feuer! Feuer!" officers shouted, but Hoth's batteries responded too late. At 5 a.m., the first Soviet wave, elements of the 38th and 60th Armies, emerged from Liutij's fog. Bayonets fixed, cries of "Ura!" echoing like a mantra of ancestral fury. Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov, platoon commander in the 267th Rifle Regiment of the 38th Army, led 40 men through the swampy shore. At 25, Dmitry was a pre-war Kiev engineer, now hardened by Smolensk. His heart pounded as he stepped on mined ground. One false step, and a telemine exploded, shredding legs. "Forward, comrades, for our brothers!" he bellowed, firing his PPSH submachine gun at a German trench. The first Germans fell, riddled with bullets, but return fire was relentless. An MG-42 mowed down entire lines, its sound like a saw ripping fabric. Dmitry saw his childhood friend Sergei fall with his skull split open, and the world reduced to a tunnel of survival. They broke through 500 meters, capturing an advanced position, but the advance stopped there, before reserves of the German 198th Infantry Regiment. To the south at Bukrin, the diversion continued, but the Germans, alerted, shifted the 24th Panzer to reinforce the north. Nearing, with his Panzer IVs and Tigers, crushed Soviet spearheads, but Vatutin smiled in his tent. The deception worked, at least in part. Rybalko, awaiting the moment, ordered his T-34 tanks, 675 armored beasts in total, to position for the next blow. Each crew checked ammunition, high explosive shells for bunkers, armor piercing for enemy tanks. The air vibrated with the muffled roar of diesel engines. On the night of November 4th, the second day of the offensive, the sun set in a sky red as fresh blood. The 3rd Guards, Tank Army and I Guards Cavalry Corps entered the fray, a tidal wave of steel and flesh. Rybalko's T-34s, camouflaged with branches and mud, advanced through the breach opened by the 38th Army, crushing barbed wire and Pak-40 anti-tank artillery. Captain Olga Petrova, one of the rare women on the front line as a sniper in the 60th Army, aimed from an elevated nest. At 24, with short hair and hawk eyes, Olga had lost her fiancé at Kharkov. Her Mosin Nagant spat death. A German officer fell with a shot to the temple at 400 meters, another with chest opened. "For you, Misha," she whispered with each shot, the recoil bruising her thin shoulder. The Germans retreated in organized panic. The 7th Corps under Bechtolsheim abandoned positions fortified for months, leaving behind abandoned guns and piles of empty cartridges. Hoth, furious, called Manstein. "They've broken through, Herr Feldmarschall. We need the 48th Panzer." Manstein, at his headquarters in Vinnitza, begged Hitler, but the Führer hesitated, sending only fragments. At midnight, Soviet vanguards spotted distant Kiev lights, the Dnieper now a thin barrier between freedom and captivity. In Kiev, Maria woke to distant thunder. Olena curled in her arms. "Is it thunder, Mama?" Maria kissed her daughter's dirty forehead. "No, love. It's the angels of victory." But fear grew. German patrols intensified searches, and rumors of forced evacuation circulated. A neighbor, old Professor Kuznetsov, had been dragged away the previous evening for hiding a radio. His scream echoed in Maria's dreams. November 5th dawned with fine rain, turning roads into rivers of mud. The 1st Independent Czechoslovak Brigade, under Major Ludwig Svoboda, joined the assault at 12:30 p.m. These brave men, exiles from their occupied homeland, attacked Kiev's western suburbs with renewed fury. Lieutenant Jan Novak, a 26-year-old Prague native with a lion tattoo on his arm, led his company through Podil, throwing grenades at machine gun nests. "Za Republiku, za Sovietsky Svaz," he shouted as bullets buzzed like angry wasps. They swept entire neighborhoods, liberating Ukrainian prisoners from a makeshift camp, and at 2 a.m. on November 6th reached the Dnieper in the city center, the first to step on free soil within Kiev. The climax came at 6:50 a.m. on November 6th. As Rybalko's tanks roared through the avenues, crushing Nazi barricades, the red flag fluttered over Vladimir's hill. Ivan Kovalenko, transferred from Bukrin to the north the previous evening, entered the city with his patched unit. The streets were a labyrinth of debris, overturned trams, facades shattered by 1941 bombs. Sporadic shots echoed, German snipers in attics, Ukrainian partisans in alleys. Ivan shot a Feldwebel emerging from a cellar, the man falling with hands raised in useless supplication. "For Alexei," Ivan murmured, stepping over the body. Maria, peering from the window, saw helmets with red stars and cried for the first time in years. "They came, Olena. They came." But victory was fragile. Manstein, desperate, convinced Hitler to release the 48th Panzer Corps, and Hoth was replaced by Erhard Raus, a relentless tactician. The second phase of the Soviet offensive began. Capture Zhytomyr, Korostin, Berdichev, and Fastov, cutting German supply lines to Army Group Center. On November 7th, Soviet vanguards reached the Fastov rail junction, 50 kilometers southwest of Kiev. The 7th Guards Tank Corps under General Pavel Rotmistrov ambushed the newly formed 25th Panzer Division of Georg Jauer, whose tanks, poorly trained and under-equipped, bogged in mud. Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Panzers, had protested their premature deployment, but Hitler ignored him. A Rotmistrov T-34 pierced a Panzer IV at 200 meters, the impact echoing like a funeral bell. On November 12th, the 38th Army took Zhytomyr after house-to-house fighting, streets running with German and Soviet blood. Dmitry Volkov, promoted to captain for bravery, cleaned his rifle in a captured basement, the air heavy with the stench of gunpowder and decomposition. "Kiev is free, but the war doesn't end here," he told a wounded soldier. The man, a Georgian named Georgi, laughed weakly. "Stalin will say it does, comrade. He always has a plan." Mid-November brought the tank battle of Brusiliv, a titanic clash north of Zhytomyr. Hermann Bauch's XLEK Panzer Corps counterattacked with the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler Division, the 1st and 7th Panzer Divisions, a tide of black steel. Hundreds of tanks collided in waterlogged fields, Soviet T-34s swiveling 85mm guns against the long 88mm of Tigers. The air trembled with explosions, smoke columns rising like pillars of judgment. Olga Petrova, now attached to a tank unit as observer, watched the chaos from a hill. A German Panther, incinerated 3 T-34s before being flanked by an Su-85. "Fire! Right!" she screamed over the radio, saving a company. But losses were horrendous. 271 Soviet tanks destroyed in 10 days against 200 German. The I Guards Cavalry Corps, legendary for its cavalry charges, advanced east of Kiev but stopped abruptly on November 17th. The Cossacks, exhausted, discovered German alcohol stocks, stolen French cognac, confiscated Ukrainian vodka, and got drunk in a pillaging orgy. "Just one sip, comrades," General Isa Pliev laughed, but hours turned to days. Vatutin, furious, reprimanded them by phone. "Guards cavalry, you look like tavern drunks." The delay allowed Rous to reinforce Fastov. In 10 days, the Soviets advanced 150 kilometers, opening a 100-kilometer gap between German Army Group Center and South. The 60th Army took Korostin on November 17th, the 40th Army moved south of Kiev, and the 27th Army, exhausted at Bukrin, assumed defense. But the rainy autumn turned roads into swamps, and the Rasputitsa, seasonal mud, swallowed guns and trucks. December 5th, with the ground freezing into a treacherous crust, Rous launched his counteroffensive. The 48th Panzer Corps, reinforced by the 2nd Parachute Division, swept north of Zhytomyr, aiming to envelop the 60th Army and 13th Soviet Corps. German tanks, now with winter tracks, crushed thin lines. Major Fritz Bauer, company commander in the 1st Panzer, watched his men freeze in compartments. "Forward to Berlin? No, to hell," he grumbled as a Soviet shell rocked his Panther. The Germans recaptured Korostin, threatening Fastov, and Vatutin ordered tactical withdrawal. But the Soviet winter was a relentless ally. Reinforcements arrived, the 1st Tank Army and 18th Army, plus additional corps. By late December, the Reds counterattacked, retaking Brusilov in fierce combat. Snow fell like white confetti over trenches filled with frozen corpses. Ivan Kovalenko, now a lieutenant, led a night patrol. The wind howled, carrying moans of wounded. A German soldier surrendered, hands raised, murmuring "Kaput." Ivan handcuffed him, thinking of Alexei, but spared his life. War had taught selective mercy. On December 22nd, the defensive operation ended in mutual exhaustion. The Soviets had lost 118,042 men, 28,141 killed or missing, 89,901 wounded or sick, plus 271 tanks and 125 aircraft. The Germans, 16,992 casualties, 2,628 dead, 13,083 wounded, 1,281 missing. But the cost was illusory. Kiev was free, the Dnieper breached, and Nazi momentum broken. Days later, on December 24th, the Dnieper-Carpathian offensive began, pushing Germans back to the 1939 Polish border through January 3, 1944. Maria Shevchenko, with Olena and Petro, watched the Reds march along Kreschatyk, tanks covered with improvised flowers. Tears streamed down her face as she waved. "Mama, is it the end?" Olena asked. Maria smiled. "Not the end, daughter. The beginning." Ivan, in a fresh trench, wrote a letter to his wife in Poltava. "I survived, love. Kiev is ours again. The East turns for us." Dmitry Volkov, promoted again, looked at the snowy horizon, dreaming of peace. Rybalko and Vatutin toasted with hot tea, knowing the tide had turned, not with fanfare but with the sweat of millions and blood of forgotten heroes. The battle for Kiev, forgotten in the annals of greater glory, was the silent pivot. There, in the Ukrainian cold, the Red Army not only liberated a city but rekindled the flame of reconquest. The fascists, once invincible, now retreated, leaving trails of defeat in the snow. And in collective memory echoed the howl of Katyushas, the roar of T-34s, and the whispers of a nation reborn.